So this video is part 2 of homeostasis and response, where we're mainly going to be focusing on hormones and the human endocrine system. So if we start off just with some basic information about the human endocrine system, some key things to bear in mind is that compared to the nervous system, the endocrine system is slow in its response, and the responses that it initiates, though, are much longer lasting, so they kind of stay around for longer. So the endocrine system then consists primarily of glands that secrete hormones into the bloodstream, so directly into the blood. Hormones are chemical messengers in a sense, and they travel to target organs where they will produce an effect. And depending on what hormone it is, obviously the effect will vary. So we need to know, first of all then, our glands that are involved in producing and secreting the hormones. The first one, the pituitary gland, is also called the master gland because it controls the other glands as well. Then we've got the thyroid gland, we've got the pancreas, adrenal glands, ovaries, and the testes. So, just a quick overview then of the main hormones that they produce. The pituitary gland, the main ones we need to know about are FSH and LH, which are involved in the menstrual cycle. The thyroid gland produces thyroxine, which we'll talk about in a second. The pancreas produces insulin and glucagon, which are involved in controlling blood glucose levels. Adrenal glands secrete adrenaline. Ovaries secrete estrogen and progesterone, again for the menstrual cycle. And the testes secrete testosterone, which is the main male sex hormone. So, just a little bit of added information for higher tier people about thyroxine and adrenaline. Adrenaline, as we've just said, is produced by the adrenal glands. And adrenaline will be secreted in times of fear and stress. And what it will do is it will evoke something that we call the fight or flight response. And by that, what will happen is the heart rate will go up, so your heart rate will increase. Increased heart rate obviously will increase the circulation of the blood, and that will ensure that an increased delivery of oxygen and glucose is received by the brain and the muscles. Okay, so increased heart rate, increased oxygen and glucose to the brain and the muscles. Thyroxine hormone then is slightly different, so that's the one produced by the thyroid gland. What that will do is it will increase the metabolic rate in all organisms, but it also, in young organisms, it controls growth and development as well. And importantly, that's one that is particularly controlled by a negative feedback loop. So what that means is that basically something will change within the levels of thyroxine, and then in response to that, the body will adjust kind of how much it secretes or produces. Okay, so moving on then to the next bit, which is relevant to everybody. We're going to look at controlling blood glucose levels. So this is primarily the job of the pancreas, and there's a few different things that will happen to control the levels. So initially we'll start off with if blood glucose levels are too high. So this could be, for instance, after eating, they will be elevated. When blood glucose levels are too high, insulin will be released from the pancreas. This will cause glucose to move from the bloodstream into cells. If there's any excess glucose, what will then happen is in the liver and the muscle cells, it will be converted into glycogen. Okay, which glycogen is a storage molecule. So when glucose is stored, it's stored as glycogen. On the other hand, if glucose levels in the blood end up too low, so say for instance you haven't eaten for a while or you've just done quite intensive exercise, what will happen then is glucagon, the hormone, will be released. This will stimulate glycogen, the storage molecule, to be converted into glucose and released into the blood. And this blood glucose control is also an example of negative feedback. So by that we mean, conditions change, so either blood glucose is high or low. The body then responds appropriately to bring it back to that normalized level. So the key thing just to bear in mind with this is glycogen and glucagon, because they're very similar words. People tend to get them confused quite a lot. Glycogen is what glucose is stored as, so it's a storage molecule, whereas glucagon is the hormone that's released when blood glucose levels are too low. Okay, so glucagon is a hormone, glycogen is the storage molecule. So, kind of tying into this, we've got to know about type 1 and type 2 diabetes. So just as a quick overview, with type 1, what happens there is it's insufficient insulin that is produced, so someone doesn't produce enough. That will leave them usually with uncontrollable high blood glucose levels, and the way around this for people with type 1 is that they have to regularly inject themselves with insulin. Okay, so that insulin is usually produced as a result of kind of genetic engineering, so bacterial cells, we should know now, can produce insulin, human insulin, so they will inject themselves with that to retain kind of normal blood glucose levels. Type 2 is slightly different. In this one, the cells no longer respond to insulin, so it is being produced, but the cells can't respond to it properly. Obesity is a risk factor for type 2, but usually with this one, it tends to be treated by diet and exercise. So a low carbohydrate diet and exercise usually is enough to actually kind of rectify or kind of manage type 2 diabetes. Okay. Moving on then to the next big section of this topic, we're going to look at the menstrual cycle. Now, with the menstrual cycle, the whole purpose of the menstrual cycle is that one mature egg is going to be released roughly every 28 days, and this is controlled by kind of 4 key hormones that do different bits of the menstrual cycle. So, if we start off with then FSH, so we've said already that this is the one that's produced by the pituitary gland, and what FSH will do is it will cause an egg to mature in the ovaries, so the follicle will mature into a proper egg, and it will also stimulate the production of estrogen. The next hormone, therefore, to be secreted is estrogen, which is secreted from the ovaries. This inhibits FSH. It stimulates another hormone called LH, which we'll talk about in a second, and it also builds the lining of the uterus up. Then the next hormone will be LH, which we've just said estrogen kind of stimulates, and LH is produced by the pituitary gland, and what LH does is it actually stimulates ovulation, so it's the one that's in charge of kind of stimulating the egg to actually be released from the ovary follicle into the oviduct. Fourth hormone involved is progesterone, and this one is secreted by the empty follicle. So once that egg's been released, progesterone will start to be secreted by that empty follicle in the ovaries. This maintains the lining of the uterus so that it's prepared for a fertilized embryo if one kind of arrives. But also what it will do is it'll inhibit FSH and it will inhibit LH. The final step of the menstrual cycle is kind of the actual menstruation or kind of the bleed. And when this will happen is when progesterone levels will fall and then menstruation will occur, so the bleed will occur and then the period, then you get the cycle starting all over again, okay? So then we go back up to here where we've got FSH and so on. So roughly every 28 days or every month, that process is what takes place. So tying into this slightly is contraception. So the whole point of contraception is to control fertility and prevent pregnancy. Now there's 2 kind of groups of contraception. There's hormonal and non-hormonal. So the hormonal ones obviously contain hormones, so typically they contain estrogen and progesterone or just progesterone. And that's things like the pill, oral contraception, the injection and the implant. Those are some examples of ones that actually contain hormones. Non-hormonal are things like the barrier methods, so condoms, intrauterine devices, spermicide, which actually will sort of disable sperm, and also just abstinence, so just not having sex, obviously will prevent pregnancy. So those are kind of the main ones for each of those 2 categories. Final bit then for homeostasis and response, and this is relevant to just higher tier only. And this is looking at increasing fertility, so we're mainly talking about in vitro fertilization, which is IVF in short. So with fertility, when it comes to kind of people that struggle to conceive, naturally they can go down the route of having IVF, and what will actually happen is they will be given FSH and LH to stimulate maturation of many eggs. The eggs will then be collected from the female. They'll be fertilized with sperm actually in a lab. And then 1 or 2 embryos will be inserted into the female's uterus, hopefully then to embed into the uterine lining and develop into a fetus. So that's the main thing there. The main one really is just remembering that it's FSH and LH that the female is given kind of artificially to overstimulate many eggs to mature. With IVF though, there's many pros and cons. There's kind of the emotional side of things. There's the physical impact on the female's body. We've also got to bear in mind the risks of inserting multiple embryos, because obviously that could result in multiple pregnancies, which can be dangerous for the mother and the babies. So there's lots of things to bear in mind with IVF, but it is something now that a lot of people kind of tend to look into if they are struggling to conceive.